One of the things that made Paul so effective at communicating the gospel to different communities was his willingness to communicate with people in a way in which they would understand. He, as the scripture verse that is sitting on the front of our church says, was willing to become whatever he needed to become in order to ensure that some could be saved. Well, we end up seeing a very interesting example of this in Romans when he starts talking about this metaphor of a tree, where Christ is the root of the tree, and then really the trunk of the tree is God's chosen people. It's the basis upon which God established his covenant. But he does something really interesting. He talks about those who actually rejected the gospel, people who saw and experienced Christ, who maybe even saw Christ, but yet they rejected the good news of grace and salvation. And instead, you end up having these Gentiles who are popping up and are now embracing readily the message of the good news of Christ. And so the way that Paul describes this is by talking about a tree and how a tree can have branches that are grafted onto it. And when those new branches are grafted onto that tree, it effectively becomes a part of that plant. And in a very real sense, once we have united ourselves with Christ, we don't just simply become another chapter of a separate group of individuals from everything else that we read in the Bible. Instead, we actually become individuals who are grafted into the family of God. Now, as with any good metaphor, you can actually take it in multiple directions, and Paul explicitly talks about a few different themes here. But there's two big ones that we want to talk about today. The first of which is talking about something that a lot of people will refer to as covenant theology. That is the theological label for it. It is this idea that we are actually individuals who are inheritors of the covenants that were established with Abraham, with Abraham's son Isaac, with Abraham's grandson Jacob. This is a covenant that isn't just like a static backdrop upon which, we read and study about God and then we are doing a completely separate thing. Instead, we are grafted into this tree. We are now a part of that chosen people, effectively a new Israel, so to speak. The second thing that we see in here that's very interesting is this idea of God pruning, grafting, and then, probably more profoundly, re-grafting branches into this tree. But let's take things one step at a time. The first thing to look at is this whole covenant theology bent here. This is something that, if you pay attention to a lot of the things that I talk about, things that I write and things I teach about, I'm very big on covenant theology, and it's because of what we read in here. It's because when we sit here and we read about all these amazing things, we read about God's faithfulness to his people throughout all creation, that isn't just something that happened to a separate group of people. That is actually something that your faith today, your faith in Jesus Christ and your faith in the cross, is based upon the same God that established those covenants with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You are inheritors of this great promise of God's redemption of his creation. What I think is really cool about the different ways of the covenant is affirmed to Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob is that each one brings its own nuance that really has a lot to say to us here today. That the first of which is, Abraham, and the fact that the covenant is being worded in such a way that it is showing that, Abraham had faith and that faith was credited to him as righteousness. And when you end up looking at that little phrase right there, you can see the exact same cornerstone upon which the covenant is built, which mirrors what Christ said he built his church on, faith. So you can see that faith is a key element there, right? So that harkens back to everything we know about Christianity and the church and everything. So kind of a profound parallel. When you end up moving on to Isaac, you can see that affirmation of the covenant mentions that all people will be blessed. That this covenant is not just for this limited group of people in this one era or during this one point in time in history or in this one geographical location. Instead, This is for all nations, that all people would be blessed through the descendants of Abraham. But even there, that can mean a lot of things. I mean, we could be, benefactors of the covenant without being individuals that actually inherit anything. But that's where the affirmation of the covenant to Jacob comes into play, because we end up seeing God communicating to Jacob, talking about the fact that his descendants would be, like dust that is spread, east, west, north, and south. Well, that verbiage is very different than everything we see spoken about, what we know of as the Hebrew people, who ended up going into the land of Canaan, that God said over and over and over again that this land of Canaan is this land that I have for you. So how do you reconcile those two things? You reconcile it because of exactly what Paul is talking about, the fact that we are grafted in. And because we are grafted in, it means that we now are indistinguishable from others who are part of God's chosen people, of His children. So we are, in effect, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's something that is a little bit mind-bending for people, because they don't like thinking of themselves that way. If we were to sit here and go into some kind of socio-historical study of the Bible, we could, I could go into all this history about, kind of the changing dynamics of how people saw their relationship with the Jews of the Old Testament and all that. But suffice to say that there is a very profound connection here that a lot of people miss, is that you are not just this free radical floating around, latching onto this truth and having to, identify your relationship with God all on your own. No. Instead, God has defined very deliberately and intentionally your relationship to Him, as He has gone through and explained what it means for you to be grafted into this people. That you now inherit the identity, so to speak, at least when it comes to the relationship between God and His people, that you read about in the Old Testament. But speaking of grafting, that's the second thing that we mentioned that Paul's analogy here in Romans, brings up. It's kind of the main part, but it's something that I think has a really big lesson in it. You see, he talks about, branches being pruned. It's kind of intuitive. People who don't hold that faith being pruned. He talks about individuals being grafted in, what we were just talking about, that you are grafted into this tree of life. But there's one more thing that's interesting, that he talks about it in the context of a people group, but then also he directs it specifically to the Christians in Rome, when he talks about branches that have been pruned being regrafted back into the tree. And that is something that is truly amazing. Because if there's one thing that's true of so many Christians, oftentimes Christians, ironically, are individuals that are the most ready to cut somebody out of their community if they did the wrong sin, or they weren't pious enough, or they said the wrong things. But instead, what you can see is the supernatural nature of Christ's grace that is willing to take even the deadest of branch and regraft it into the tree of life, so long as it believes. The significance of that regrafting cannot be overstated. I want you to understand this, that when we look at the power of God, the fact that God has the power to regraft back into the tree, this is something that is actually earth-shattering when it comes to any other kind of religion or philosophical code that you want to try to reference. God freely offers grace. He freely offers salvation, and the only thing that is required in return is for you to believe, to have faith in that salvation. That is something that it has to always bring you to your knees. I don't know about any of you, but I can tell you this, that I have not been a perfect person. When I say that, I don't just mean that in the whole, I have a past and all that kind of stuff, and I turned from it and I've been great ever since. I sin all the time. I've done things that I regret. I've done things that to this day, as much as, you're supposed to hand things over to God and all that. I mean, kind of the flesh struggles sometimes to let go of guilt of things that I've done. And I know that sometimes when I really get inside of my head, that little Satan in your life, that very real spiritual warfare, can start just kind of talking little things into my ear. trying to pull me away from what I know to be truth. So when you look at that, and when you look at those feelings of guilt, those things that we hold on to, or maybe those things that other people want to point at you and accuse you of, those are things that they can feel impossible to overcome. And I'm here to tell you that they kind of are for you. The reality is that some things in this world are going to be things that we, of our own power, cannot overcome. But that's the whole point of being grafted into the tree of life, is because when we do that, our root is Christ. And the roots are the source of nourishment. It's the source of sustainment. It's the source of strength for the entire tree. So the question for you is, as you look at your own life and you look at your own faith, upon what are you rooted? Are you simply looking, or maybe trying to, benefit from the shade of the tree of life? Or are you actually grafted in? Are you receiving your strength, and are you receiving your firm rooting from Jesus Christ? Because ultimately, that is going to be the only thing that has the power to regraft you back into this holy people, into this chosen nation that God has shown His faithfulness to over and over and over again. And if you have faith, and you will have Him in your heart, if you will surrender to Him, then you too will see God's faithfulness the way He has shown He can be over and over and over again. That's our lesson that we have for today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.